Hi, I'm Mary Corcoran, and this is our last video for the 9 o'clock sharp quilt. It's putting on borders. When I'm going to start with borders, I want to think about what's going to go on the quilt first, and in this case we have 3 borders. A plain little yellow one, which helps the quilt float in the borders, a little accent narrow border, and then the final border. When you're putting on borders, a careful quilter is going to measure through the quilt and create a border that fits the quilt, rather than just taking a border and sewing it on the edge and lopping off what's left on the end. What happens is sometimes as we work on a quilt, it can grow a little bit through our handling it, so that the edges may actually measure a little bit more than the middle. And the middle measurement is what's going to help the quilt be flat and true when you've got your borders on it. So we want to measure through the middle. A couple of different options for measuring your border is to take measurements through 3 areas of the quilt, close to each edge and one through the center, and then take the average of that. I typically am careful enough as I go along that I feel like my quilt is pretty accurate and square, so I just measure through the middle. And so, as I said earlier, what I prefer to do is measure the border against the quilt itself rather than taking a measure and then putting that on the border piece. So what I've done is I've got the 2 borders that go on first, the 2 sides, and I've cut them, so I have a clean up cut on this end, and I've pinned them together, and now I'm going to just take and put them exactly on the edge of the quilt and add another pin so they're pinned to the quilt. And then I'm just going to smooth them so they come down through the center of the quilt. I don't want to stretch the borders. I don't want to stretch the quilt. I just want to secure and pat them in place so they stay through the middle of the quilt so that the measurement is accurate. Now you can see that the quilt is longer than my table surface, and that often happens. So I'm going to pull the quilt that way until I've exposed the end. And again, I'm just patting to secure. And when I come all the way down here to the end, I'm ready to now trim these borders to be the exact length that the quilt is. Let me grab a ruler and let's do that. Any ruler that's wider than your border is going to work for this part of the process. What we want to do is lay the ruler on the quilt and make sure this border, this final edge, is measuring. It was cut at 3 1/2, so since one side is now sewn down, it's going to be 3 1/4. So we can measure that over from the edge and find that that is straight. And so now I can cut off the ends of this border, and this border is ready to sew on the quilt. I like to be accurate at this point. I've been careful to this point, so I'm going to be careful now. What I want to do is pin the border to the quilt, locating the center and the ends. An easy way to find the center of a border is just to fold the border in half. I'm going to match the ends and just pull it out. Once I've got the middle identified, all I have to do is pinch it hard between a finger and a thumb, and I'm going to end up with a mark that I can see. And if you want to add a little pin to that just to be able to find it more easily, you can do that. And now I want to find the center of the quilt to match this to. On a quilt like this, I don't need to measure the whole side to find it. I can find it in the piecing, and so this block is the middle on this side. If it was one of these, I would have a point to pin to, but since it's this block, I want to find an accurate middle to that. So I'm going to fold this block in half, and I'm going to also pinch this. And what I can do now is line up my 2 pinch marks and put the pin right in there. Now my centers are matched. I'm going to match my ends and continue to pin. Okay, what I've done now is I've pinned the end of the border to the corner of the quilt, and I've pinned the center here. And so now I'm going to work in this space, and I want to add enough pins to make sure that when I sew things together they stay flat and even, which means that when you look on the back, these piecing elements should be pinned so that they stay flat so that the seam allowances continue to go in the direction that I've put them and we don't end up with twisted seams behind. So I really want to just slide some pins in, staying fairly parallel to the seams, just where the seams hit. And you can see that this border is pretty flat along here, which means that the quilt is probably flat and square because the measurement from the middle fits on the outside. And so it's just an easy matter of sliding in some pins in the places where the seams are to hold things flat. Unfortunately, borders don't always lay flat on the side. Sometimes our piecing has gotten just a little bit wonky, and so at this point we have to figure out what are we going to do about it. When it's just a little bit off and you're this part in the quilt, depending on what the quilt is for, if you're going to throw it over the back of the couch and enjoy it and love it and have it on the bed, whatever you're going to do, if it's not going to hang flat on a wall and go to a show, if it's a little bit off, let's just fudge. So at this point, what I want to do is look at the end is pinned, the center's pinned, but look, those two things are not exactly the same. So what I want to do is just kind of pull this a little bit. Fabric, unlike wood, has some give, so we're going to use that. I'm going to take my fingers and put them on one end and the other end and pull a little bit until the two elements lay flat together. And I'm going to go as far as I can reach over with my thumb. Capture that, and now I can pin at this place. And that's a seam. And again, I'm going to kind of tug them a little bit so they lay flat together. And I'm going to take my thumb over and I'm going to pin this seam. So when you're easing in, one fabric or the other, whether it's the border or the quilt, is a little bit longer, what I'll do is I'll use the stretch in the fabric, stretch it out, capture a place, because that evens things out and it creates ease along the quilt. You're not ending up with too much bulk at one end or the other. It's shared over the entire width of the quilt, a little bit in each place, which means when you sew things together, you're not going to end up with puckers or big problems. It's just a small little easing that will make things okay.